Good afternoon, everybody. I know last week was Easter, and it may have been a little odd for some of us not being able to celebrate Easter how we normally do, gathering with friends and family and everything due to our social distancing right now. But in light of that, we wanted to put together this short little devotional thought to offer you some encouragement on this beautiful Sunday afternoon and to just reflect a little bit on kind of what life kind of means in light of Easter, right? So, directly after Easter, some people may feel a little bit lost as to where we're supposed to go, what we're supposed to do, right? We can think of it in the sense of Jesus was crucified, then he resurrected, and that seems to be pretty like a definitive statement of like victory, so to speak. Almost kind of like, the team that wins the Super Bowl on Sunday, when they show up to practice the next day on Monday, they might be wondering, well, all right, what did we do now? What should we be doing? Because it seems like yesterday kind of we accomplished everything that we wanted to do. So we might have a little lack of clarity in the time directly following Easter, right? And this is not something unique to us right now. Even in the Bible, the disciples directly after Easter were experiencing a time of flux as well, because during Jesus's life, there had been this very clear focus that the disciples were supposed to literally be following him. They were to learn from him and minister to people according to his teaching, and he was right there with them to provide immediate guidance and immediate instruction, immediate feedback. And when Jesus was crucified, though, this immediate guide that they were following was no longer available like he had been. So today we just wanted to do a little devotion in the book of John, chapter 21, verses 15 through 17. So we read here, "When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Or do you love me more than the other disciples that were sitting around?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' Then Jesus said to him, 'Feed my lambs.' Then Jesus asked him a second time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' And he answered him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' So Jesus said to him, 'Tend my sheep.' And then he asked him a third time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' And Peter was grieved because he had asked him a third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you.' And Jesus said to him, 'Feed my sheep.'" See, in this passage, we see a really compelling event take place. Jesus is restoring Peter, and Peter went by the name Simon Peter in some accounts. So Jesus is restoring Peter from when he had denied him 3 times earlier. Jesus asks Peter a single question 3 times, "Do you love me?" And in a moment of incredible poetic redemption, Peter answers, "You know I love you." And then Christ instructs Peter 3 times to feed his sheep. So what's incredible about this is that Jesus gives Peter a chance for redemption. And even more, he tells Peter what the manifestation of this love is supposed to look like on the ground in the real world. It's sort of like a call and response type interaction, or like an if-then statement. Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" Then feed my sheep. 3 times Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" 3 times Peter answers, "You know I do." And 3 times Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." So when I'm reading this passage, it hits my ears, I can't help but put myself in Peter's position. Now, we don't really want to end up like Peter, because a couple of verses later, the text mentions that that Peter is going to be crucified himself, so nobody wants to end up like that. But generally speaking, I think I'm like many people in the sense that I want to think of myself as one of the people feeding the sheep and not actually being one of the sheep, you know? is as people, we don't want to be one of the sheep. We celebrate not being part of the crowd. We celebrate our individuality. We don't want to be sheep because sheep are vulnerable. Sheep are not in control. We want to be in control of our lives, and sheep are helpless. We don't like feeling helpless. We like to feel in control. And because of this, it's a pretty good reason why when we think of leadership in the world today, it's often synonymous with our own control. There's comfort knowing that we are in control. And sometimes our tendency to try to control things, it can escape our notice. So it may be a little easier to see it active in other people's lives than in our own. I know many people, many pastors even, that you can tell have an almost obsessive need for control. And then you can tell there's a lot of rationalizing going on about this, rationalizing over these controlling tendencies that are some kind of, like somehow under the guise of being godly leadership, right? But what is really tough about this, and what we have to come to terms with, is a lot of times this is an attempt to be God in our own lives. Similar to how Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the Garden of Eden. They were surrounded by paradise, and there was one single limitation that was placed on them. And yet they were the ones wanting to be in control. So they disobeyed God. They asserted themselves in order to try to be like God, so the text says. And many leaders today, many ministers do this. But we can sometimes just call it ministry so as to make it permissible. So now think about this. The best way for me to measure my own need for control in my life, and we can all think about this, and we can try this, is to measure our frustration with non-compliance. I'll admit sometimes I'm not the best passenger on a road trip. Sometimes I take it upon myself to offer, helpful feedback regarding the driver's technique. I'm sure I know people, this sounds familiar. All right, and even if we don't think ourselves guilty of this, I'm sure we can all think of somebody who gives us feedback when we're driving, right? And it's very irritating. Because we have this remarkable ability to want to express our own autonomy in the face of another person's efforts to control. If somebody tells us to do X, we automatically want to do Y just out of sheer defiance. See, and we cringe at this. We cringe at this because it's so painfully obvious that someone just wants to exert control over the situation. Even if their advice is good, we want to resist just because we assume, or just because they assume that they should be the ones giving orders and we should be the ones following them. Subconsciously, this registers so many things in our minds. We register that they think they're smarter than us. We register that they think they're more capable than us. We register that they disapprove of us. And this is really tough because nobody likes to feel any of these things, which is why we cringe when we register that somebody thinks they're better than us, right? Even in in ministry, I'd rather listen to a sermon from somebody, without much theological training than somebody who just wants to make it clear to everybody in the room that they are the boss, right? It's an abusive power dynamic to be in, and can be really harmful for people caught in this dynamic because people don't do very well being manipulated. The incredible thing about this text, though, is that Jesus sets a wonderful counterexample for us to follow. Jesus is very clear. If you love me, feed my sheep and follow me. And it sounds easy enough, but at its heart, it's something very difficult for us to abide by. See, if we're following someone, we have no say in where we're going. And if we're following somebody, we also have no say in where other people are going. And what irks us is when we see another one of the sheep straying from the path, so to speak. We want to set them straight. It feels good to get somebody to kind of course correct, right? And it's hard for us to follow Jesus, though, if we're busy telling his sheep where they should be going. So John chapter 10:27 says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." Right? So it should come as absolutely no surprise to us that when his sheep hear our voice, they resist. So after all, John 10:5 says, "A stranger they will not follow. They will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." Today, in the body of Christ and in the world, what we need is the ability to lead without the need for control. See, Christ's leadership is not to reflect the world's idea of leadership. It's to, on our own, walk straight ahead toward the cross and invite others to follow, knowing full well that many won't, and then to think no less of them because of that. So we forget that Jesus promised suffering and ridicule to those who follow him. So he's telling Peter later in this passage that he's also going to get crucified. So it seems strange that sometimes the mental picture of evangelism is like, a hired hand trying to corral cattle and drive them toward the cross. I mean, that's very, dehumanizing for a lot of people. So our leadership in the church and our witness, to people who are curious at what we do, is not to be one of pushing people. It's to be of inviting people. We are never to violate the autonomy of another person. Christians have done this in the past, which is why many have such a low opinion of faith and see it as an instrument of oppression. And the truth is, though, that faith is an instrument of oppression when faith leaders have a need for control. Yet the rub is that we crave control, and we get upset when others disrupt our control. So consequently, we try to alter their behavior, and they typically resist, which compounds the frustration and eventually boils over into open conflict, right? As hard as we might try, the human soul has been formed to respond only to a single voice, and that voice is not ours. Our efforts to ethically and morally shape people can only produce a single outcome, which is to drive them away not only from us, but from Christ as well, and ruin relationships in the process. I know there are many people who have very stressed relationships with family members, with friends, because there existed this need to control and this need to shape other people, right? So throughout history, when people take it upon themselves to morally shape other people, the people resist, and the process becomes permanently embittered. I mean, even toward God. All right? Because when we take it upon ourselves to lead Jesus' sheep, our eyes turn toward the sheep and away from Jesus. So, if we're going by this passage, if our main responsibility to people, and that's to people everywhere, because if you believe, and I do, that God created all people, then kind of as a logical, consequence of that, all people are to be treated as image bearers of, the God that I worship, the God that we worship, right? And that's a pretty tall order, right? And if Jesus in this passage is telling us that our main responsibility is to feed them, then what does it look like to feed these people, to feed the people that God created, or, Jesus's sheep? Well, that should be easy because we're sheep too, right? So what feeds us? What inspires us? Not just physically, but spiritually as well. See, the word for gospel in Greek is euangelion. It's a cool term. It means good news. The good news of the gospel, right? The gospel is hope. And people respond to hope. People's souls are fed, knowing that the one they are following is leading them into redemption and toward a future where his victory over sin and death can be our victory too. So now in this season of Easter blessing, we just kind of, as a collective church in the body of Christ. We just want to galvanize our status as sheep that feed other sheep. We want to relinquish our need for control of other people. That our presence in people's lives should be a blessing, in the sense that at the very least their day should be better, right? So with this, I want to just offer this little bit of encouragement to you this Sunday afternoon, and we'll leave you with this simple blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you his peace this day and every day. Amen.